Again, what we're really dealing with are largely local insurgencies connected by money, connected by foreign fighters, small numbers, connected by an ideology. But it really is about, at this point in the campaign, I think it's about ISIS attempting to leverage insurgencies that exist in various parts of the world, and then our efforts to keep these groups from actually being connected and being effective at sharing tactics, techniques, procedures, money, foreign fighters, and those kinds of things. And again, I think what Mr. McGurk's efforts have done, and our partners on the ground, our Iraqi partners on the ground, our Syrian partners, what they have done, I think, in large part, when you look at Raqqa and Mosul, one of the more significant things it's done, besides denying physical space of the enemy, I think it's also undermined the credibility of the narrative, one of those three things I described as enabler. And I say undermine the credibility of the narrative because if you recall, 2 years ago, the narrative was the establishment of a physical caliphate, a perfect Islamic world that they were trying to incentivize young people from around the world to join them. And I think today we can safely say that narrative doesn't have much credibility.
Just to follow up from Tammy's
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just go right to left, all right? So that way.
Thank you, General Dunford. Lucas Tomlinson, Fox News. Was that 12-man Special Forces team authorized to go after ISIS or Al-Qaeda leaders in Niger?
The rules for that particular 12-man team are they were authorized to accompany Nigerian forces when the prospects of enemy contact was unlikely. That is the rules under which they were operating.
So it's a report that they were going after a terrorist leader. Is that just not true?
Again, when the investigation is complete, we'll know the full details of the patrol. What I mentioned to you yesterday is probably what I say today. We know what the mission was initially. We know what the assessment was initially. And we know what the framework is within which our forces are conducting operations in Niger. I'm not willing to speculate on what happens subsequent to that because, again, I think it's important that we complete the investigation, we determine the facts, we share the facts with the families, and then we share them with you. And at the time we share the facts with you, we will answer all the questions that you have, and we'll make sure that those questions are answered again, first and foremost to the families.
Authorities. A very important decision was made back in May about how to prosecute the Raqqa campaign that the President made, which allowed us, I think, to complete the Raqqa operation. So I think it's moving faster, more efficiently, more effectively due to some really critical changes that were made in the strategic review led by Secretary Mattis and the whole interagency team with Secretary Tillerson and the chairman. So having just come back, actually I was in Syria last week, you can really get a sense of the momentum that's really building now. Our training classes for the forces we're training are all full. We have more recruits than we could train. So it's really kind of taken on a really positive momentum, a snowball effect, and so we feel pretty good about it.
In addition to what Mr. McGurk said, I think you would agree. I'd also point to the continued capability development of our partners on the ground. So if you look at where the Iraqis were in the fall of 2015, and you compare their combat capability to 2017, they have improved significantly over the last 2 years. If you look at where we were in the fall of 2015, at one point I think we had identified about 175 partners in Syria that we had trained and were available, maybe some hundreds that were available to fight. We now have over 50,000 partners on the ground, half of those partners Arab partners. And so the growth of our partners over time compared to the decision-making process and frankly the momentum that all has generated, I think has fed the success that we have seen in Raqqa and Mosul. And the only thing I'd add to is that one of our themes today was that this is an inflection point. It's not the end of the campaign, and a strong emphasis on the need to keep the coalition that Mr. McGurk has helped to craft, to keep that coalition together for the long term. The next phase of the campaign is equally important to the clearing phase, the stabilization phase, and the enabling of local security forces to make the security that we have gained enduring.
Just one follow, Mr. Chairman. What is the next phase for the coalition post-Raqqa?
Yeah, I mean, the first step is the stabilization efforts that Mr. McGurk has helped pull together with the international community, the United Nations, non-governmental organizations, the European Union, and other groups, and he can talk to that stabilization. I mean, it's critical that we meet the people's needs. As we have been in Mosul, we must in Raqqa and elsewhere meet their immediate needs. Obviously, the basics of water, food, electricity it would be the beginnings. The other key piece will be to continue to work with our Iraqi partners to make sure that their capability development continues, and ideally, in the near future, they will have the capability to be self-sustaining. And I say near future, I look at the near future as 3 to 5 years. I mean, it's an effort that's going to take some time. But that is the next phase in Iraq and Syria. The next phase for us more broadly is to expand our information intelligence sharing, which was a strong theme of today. Again, to make sure that we cut that connective tissue, the enabling capabilities that, again, I talked about foreign fighters, resources, and narrative, but to get after those strategically, and then continue in areas like today's briefs, G5 Sahel, we had a brief on that. You obviously have tracked events in Libya, you're tracking events with AMISOM in East Africa. We just talked about Iraq and Syria. We continue to support our Afghan partners on the ground in Afghanistan, also dealing with ISIS, also a key part of our fight against Al-Qaeda. And then in Southeast Asia, we see some very promising initiatives. Today we spoke about Indonesia and the Philippines and Malaysia and the cooperation that they have had in sharing information. And of course, the efforts that have taken place in Malawi have been as a result of some of the support that the Philippines has received. And so this is all about, again, making sure that these local efforts and regional efforts all benefit from the framework that we have in place for a broader global network.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for your time today, gentlemen as well. In light of the shift away from Iraq and Syria, or at least the discussion of looking at other places more closely, and also the rebranding of local insurgencies as we've seen in Niger, were there any discussions today about expanding in that region, additional ISR, additional U.S. enablers, additional authorities, anything along those lines?
No, first of all, I just want to clarify, we are not shifting our attention away from Iraq or Syria
Sure.
yet. And again, I think one of the points that was made several times today is the need for the coalition to stay focused on Iraq and Syria, for an enduring period of time. The only discussion that we spoke about today, really about resources, is the G5 Sahel, which is a very promising initiative, is standing up. And we received a briefing about the resources they have available, and there's obviously some fiscal resources that are required, and so that was discussed, but obviously the group that was here today was not in a position to discuss that in detail. But there was no discussion about additional forces, additional capabilities. That conversation would be premature.
As you look at it, do you see any needs yourself?
No, I think what I would say is that we're constantly looking at the enemy. We're looking at the enemy as he adapts. We're trying to stay ahead and anticipate where the enemy will be tomorrow, which is important, and looking for opportunities. This isn't about just going where the enemy has gone. This is about anticipating where the enemy will go and making sure that we set the conditions for them to receive a very inhospitable reception when they get there by local forces. So we're constantly looking at that and making adjustments in our campaign and making recommendations to the Secretary and the President as to reprioritization and reallocation of resources if we think that's required.
Thank you so much for doing this. Just to follow up on an earlier question, to be clear, did you see ISIS moving into the African continent? They wanted to go to the Philippines, they couldn't, or Libya, they couldn't, they tried the Philippines, they can't, are they now shifting to the African continent?
Yeah, again, I would probably avoid characterizing it as a major shift of ISIS. I think that what ISIS is absolutely trying to do is leverage local insurgencies now to rebrand themselves. They are trying to maintain relevance. The message 2 years ago was they were going to have a physical caliphate. The message now is local fighters ought to stay where they are and conduct terrorism locally. So ISIS is attempting to maintain relevance by leveraging these local insurgencies and by dealing particularly in places like the G5 Sahel brief that we received today, or Libya, or Sinai, or smaller presence in East Africa. But I don't think it's fair to say that we've seen a large flow of ISIS influence or a large flow of ISIS leadership into Africa. In fact, that's exactly what we're trying to prevent by having a common understanding of the fight and preparing these countries to deal with the challenges ahead. We want to make sure that ISIS actually has no safe haven, no coldest corner of the room, if you will, to go to after Iraq and Syria. And of course, that's complemented by our efforts in Iraq and Syria to make sure we annihilate the enemy in Iraq and Syria and we don't allow them to leave.
Very well explained, I'm sorry. go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, one, I thought the benefits of the discussion today is it's violent extremist organizations, not just ISIS. So in the Sahel, for example, some of these extremist groups raise the banner of ISIS, but others are Al-Qaeda, others have their own affiliations. You know, part of Boko Haram went to ISIS, but they're all part of the same ideology. And General McMaster actually came and gave we had a very good discussion about how do you take a network, how do you take these types of groups and just really analyze them and begin to sever their connections so that they can't get out of their local area. Financing, how do they move and everything. So whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's Boko Haram, it's kind of a similar approach. But in that part of the world, we want to make sure that it's really contained. They can't infiltrate the micro networks and contain it in the Sahel. I thought it was a pretty good discussion we had today about that.
And the second question on cutting the connective tissue, what does that look like for the military? Is that training and advising assist? Is it counterterrorism, direct action, direct combat missions, drone strikes? Will it depend, and what does it look like for the State Department?
I think what you're alluding to, it is largely, the whole of government approach is going to have to deal with those three. I think the military dimension, number one, is the information intelligence sharing that we're doing with our partners, and this military network that we spoke about today is designed to do just that, complement the broader intelligence relationships that we have between our countries, the law enforcement relationships we have with our countries, so information sharing is one part of it. I think the key contribution that the military makes to the countering the narrative is enabling our partners to be successful on the ground, which is one of the best ways to discredit the narrative. And with regard to the resources, I think that information intelligence sharing that we're doing at the military to military level is also what makes a contribution to the broader campaign. But at the end of the day, to be successful in the State Department, of course, leads our counter-messaging campaign. And we also spoke today with the Saudi-led effort, which will help, I think, with credible Islamic voices to discredit the narrative as well. And I don't know, maybe Mr. McGurk has something else to add, but again, the military dimension is largely information sharing plus our operations on the ground that would contribute to the counter-messaging campaign.
Our coalition's organized. It's military support, it's counter-finance, it's counter-foreign fighters, it's counter-messaging, and then it's humanitarian stabilization. That's how we organize ourselves globally. And I think it's the approach that we use in Iraq and Syria. It's kind of a very intense approach, obviously a significant portion of the effort. But same tools can work elsewhere. And you have to attack it whole of government, take a network-based approach. So that's what we discussed today.
Jim?
To the connective tissues, the foreign fighters, the finances, and the narrative. One would argue, or one could argue, that the narrative is the toughest to defeat. And while the physical defeat of the caliphate is one thing, the narrative still has appeal in many, many places. And I'd like just you to address that a little bit, and specifically, why is it so important that Saudi Arabia is leading that effort to defeat the narrative?
Sure. I mean, Jim, I'll start, and then Mr. McGurk can certainly have something to add to this. I think you've correctly identified that as probably one of the toughest challenges is to counter the narrative. I would say this: I'm encouraged, not complacent, but I'm encouraged by how the success on the ground has translated into undermining the credibility of the narrative. And I think the numbers of foreign fighters that are flowing into the region is an indicator. There's been some studies on the numbers of young people that are radicalized, and those numbers seem to go down, and I'm loath to give specifics, but there's certainly indicators that fewer young people are radicalized. And again, I think that's as a result of us being able to demonstrate ISIS for what it is. I mean, they can only behead so many people and treat people the way they treated them in Mosul and Raqqa, and those stories have gotten out. And young people who actually were motivated to join them have returned back home now and exposed the truth about the Islamic State. And so I think that's all been particularly helpful. With regard to the question about the Saudi-led effort, I think the number is 41 nations that are represented in that initiative, 41 Islamic nations. Clearly, credible Islamic voices are the ones that are going to resonate the most in countering the narrative of ISIS and in countering it and discrediting it for what it is. And so we're actually encouraged. Last year, they gave us a brief, and it was really at the conceptual level. And this year, they actually have now established a center in Saudi Arabia. And over the next year, we expect that their initiatives will start to pay dividends. So I really do think those 41 Islamic nations are the ones that have the most credibility to take the lead in countering this message that ISIS has attempted to distribute. But again, I think it is tough, but I have seen some indicators that they're having a more difficult time with their message resonating.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we track their propaganda week to week. It's really interesting because 3 years ago, most of their propaganda, when you looked at it, was this actually, they put out this positive message. That was the vast majority of their propaganda. It was this, we're a historic movement, come join, come to the homeland, these kind of sun-drenched scenes of families and friends. That was kind of most of their propaganda. And I think that actually did attract a lot of people. Whole families came for a time. They don't do that. That's not in their propaganda anymore. They are now really appealing to like criminal elements of our society, rather than saying come be a part of a historic movement. They're literally saying go grab a knife, drive a truck. Very different message to a very smaller segment of any community. Still a huge problem, law enforcement intelligence challenge, but it is not. They can no longer do this mass appeal. And there is a religiously based messaging component to their propaganda, and that's why having Saudi Arabia in the lead of a lot of this is so critical. Together with Egypt, UAE, we have a 24/7 messaging hub. Malaysia, we have a 24/7 messaging hub. UK. So we attack this globally, but it is really significantly different than 3 years ago compared to what they put out. But we're gonna keep at it. As they change their message, we'll adapt to make sure we're countering it.
And just one real quick one maybe to the Colonel.
Sure, Colonel Kelly.
Because we have to help our Australian allies here, but coalition is 73 nations in it now. Can the coalition get too big? Do you want more nations in the coalition?
So I'm an exchange officer on loan to the US and work for the Joint Staff, so I don't work back to Australia. What I bring to the Joint Staff, I think, is a diversity of perspective. And it's that diversity of perspective that we're looking for in our planning as we take this effort forward. So can it become too big? I don't think so. I think the price of admission is wanting to be part of solving the problem.
Let me reinforce that. I think Colonel Kelly has it exactly right. First of all, in this coalition, the group that we spoke about today, we're not trying to create another organization. This is one of the points I made in my opening comment. What we're trying to do is make the local, regional, multilateral efforts more successful. So we're not trying to put some structure above the G5 Sahel or what's going on in Amazon or what's going on in Iraq and Syria, what's going on in Afghanistan. What we're trying to do by exchanging information and intelligence is make those local and regional efforts more effective. So in that regard, I don't think it can be too big. In fact, the bigger the better, because the more nations that come, and the price of admission is merely to come and attend and exchange information. But the one thing I think I've seen in terms of comparing this year to last year is the common understanding of the nature of the threat is in my judgment, much more sophisticated than even 12 months ago. And so just that can't help but make our operations more effective. And frankly, it can't help but have these chiefs of defense return home and have an effective conversation with their political leadership to make sure that we are integrated not only across all of these efforts, but within all of these efforts. The kind of whole of government approach that Mr. McGurk is leading in Syria and Iraq is one that also must take place in the G5 Sahel and East Africa, Southeast Asia. And that actually, Jim, was probably one of the big takeaways today was, again, making these organizations more effective by, number one, cutting that connective tissue, and number two, a much more effective way to share information and intelligence, because again, these groups are connected, and the less that they are connected, and the more we prop up local security forces and give them the capability to deal with those challenges, the closer we come to the end state. And the end state actually is getting to the point where the security challenges in the respective countries or regions can be dealt with largely by local security forces with a minimal amount of international support. And I think there's going to be some degree of international support required in many of these locations for some time to come, just given the governance issues and the economic issues that they confront. But getting that down to a minimum level makes it a sustainable effort. And that's one thing we also spoke about, is that if this is in fact a generational struggle, in the sense that the underlying conditions that feed extremism and terrorism will take a generation to address. The military dimension has to be sustainable over time. So it needs to be sustainable from a military perspective, sustainable from a political perspective, and sustainable from a fiscal perspective. And again, largely focused on making sure that local forces can deal with this in a more effective way. And that's what this broader representation of countries was designed to do today.
One more thing, most of their messaging was coming out of Raqqa. That was their hub, that was where they put everything together, that's where they put their products together, and they can't do that anymore. Very different using an infrastructure of a city, which they were doing in Raqqa, to put all this stuff out, and to plan and plot attacks against us. Remember Jihadi John, he used to just sit in an apartment building with hundreds of people, so he knew he couldn't be targeted, and he was a computer hacker sitting there trying to inspire people to attack people around the world. They were using Raqqa as their hub, and they don't have Raqqa anymore. And it's very different for them to be in some very small village deep in the Euphrates Valley than to be in Raqqa. So their messaging platform in Raqqa, to say the least, is no longer available to them.
Ladies
Go
and gentlemen.
second row.
Yeah.
But
We have time for about 2 more questions.
okay.
Okay, first a quick follow-up on your discussion about these rebranded local insurgencies. Can you give us a ballpark of how many groups we're talking, and what level of connection to ISIS are we talking? Are we talking just a rebranding, or ISIS in Iraq and Syria being able to pass along tactics they've learned about using commercial drones to these groups
Yeah.
elsewhere?
That is a great question, a complicated question, and one that would take a long time to answer. But I'll make a stab at giving you, kind of an overview. And so there's many groups that have pledged allegiance to ISIS. And one thing that's interesting is ISIS actually had some pretty strict criteria to be a part of ISIS maybe 12, 18 months ago, some pretty strict criteria. They've stopped kind of sanctioning, if you will, organizations that want to be a part of ISIS. And so we haven't seen much of the qualifications, to be a part of ISIS. I think that's an indicator. But in terms of general areas, I mean, the ones that we spoke about today, so I'll just speak generally, certainly in West Africa, ISIS is attempting to leverage local insurgencies. We certainly see a concentration, and we've been disrupting them over the past year in Libya. We see an ISIS concentration in the Sinai that Egypt has been working on here now for some time. And certainly there's a smaller ISIS presence in East Africa. We obviously have spoken a lot about the ISIS presence in Syria, in Iraq. There's a smaller ISIS presence, ISIS Khorasan, that we're dealing with in Afghanistan. And then we spoke today about Marawi and really Southeast Asia, where there's been an effort for ISIS to gain traction, although the recent success by the Philippines has certainly set that effort back. So I describe it in broad geographic areas, and that really probably captures the essence of our conversation today.
Okay.
I'll give you a follow-up if you want. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So I guess succinctly, when, if at all, do you say ISIS is defeated?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, ISIS is defeated when they no longer operate as a trans-regional terrorist organization, and when the groups that maybe identify themselves as ISIS can be dealt with by local security forces. That'd be my perspective of our criteria for success. And again, the thing I would emphasize today, and part of our conversation, was that this wasn't all about ISIS, right? This was about violent extremism, and that's something I think we're going to be dealing with for some time to come. There'll be other permutations of the ISIS movement in the future, and our idea is now to make sure that the nations that are most at risk actually have the wherewithal to deal with those challenges in the years ahead.
Connor Finnegan with ABC News. Forgive me, I just want to ask one more question about Niger as well. Can you say at all whether or not the CIA was involved in the events in Niger?
What I can tell you is I have no knowledge of CIA involvement, and if there's any other government organizations that are involved, that may or may not come out in the investigation, but I'm not sure what you're alluding to, and I don't know anything about it. I can say that definitively.
Okay. And just one quick follow-up on the connective tissue issue. I know you mentioned troop deployments and intelligence sharing, but specifically, can you say whether or not there will be new troops deployed to different countries like Niger as part of these training missions or ISR missions?
No, I can tell you that we have not had discussions about additional resources in any of these efforts. I think it's fair to say that We're still focused right now on finishing our work in Iraq and Syria. We're not trying to look past that. That is our main effort, to make sure we get that right, to keep the coalition together, to complete the job. And we're certainly assessing the next phase of the fight. You know, again, I characterize this as an inflection point. It's a significant change in the campaign. But I would tell you this, you know, we have an ongoing dialogue with all of our combatant commanders to try to anticipate what's next and to make sure that we reprioritize and reallocate resources to stay out in front of the enemy. We do have an opportunity now to anticipate and be out front. I think it's fair to say 2 years ago we were reactive, and I think as a result of what's happening in Iraq and Syria, we have an opportunity to get out in front of the enemy. I think it's fair to say that ISIS is on their heels right now. Our job is to make sure they don't recover.
We'll just do Qasim and then we'll end it.
Chairman, Raqqa was liberated with the support of the coalition and the millions of dollars of American taxpayers and also American troops on the ground, but the SDF dedicated the Raqqa victory to the PKK leader Öcalan. I know the Pentagon condemned this thing, but YPG says it was Öcalan's and PKK's ideology that enabled them to that victory for Raqqa. Do you agree with that assessment, and what is your reaction to these things happening in Raqqa?
Yeah, what I would tell you is that we condemn the PKK as a terrorist organization, and we stand with our Turkish allies and we share their characterization of the PKK.
And also to Mr. McGurk, have you talked to SDF about the display of Öcalan's pictures in Raqqa and his messages being said on live video shots inside Raqqa during the victory inauguration?
Yeah, I think as the chairman said, I think we've spoken very clearly about this issue and in that particular display on that day.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Hey, let me just finish by saying thanks. I mean, this is late in the day, and you had to come all the way down to Fort Belvoir, but I appreciate it. I mean, I really do, because I thought the message coming out of today, to have 75 nations here that are developing a common understanding of the fight and a shared commitment to respond collectively, is actually a pretty significant event. And I got to tell you, I was hopeful that we would have a productive day, and the day just exceeded my expectations in terms of maturity of dialogue and the shared commitment of the chiefs of defense to sit around the table to get after this issue. And again, with the supplemented by Mr. McGurk's presentation, General McMaster's presentation, I think we spoke not only about the military dimension of the problem, but more broadly the whole of government efforts that need to be pulled together in order for us to be successful. So thanks for coming down.